Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Boundary Breakers. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Leah Kelley. Leah is an associate lawyer and advocate for
Oh,
disability
hang
inclusion.
on. I'm associate. I'm not a lawyer.
Okay. Thank you for
Associate
correcting me.
professor.
Actually, that's a great question. We'll get into what the difference is between that in a second. And who is someone that is passionate about breaking down societal barriers around aging and disability. With a rich background in research and education, Leah brings a unique perspective to our conversation, highlighting the importance of embracing the term disability and fostering inclusivity across all areas of life. We are excited to dive into her insights and experiences, and we welcome you to the show, Leah.
Thank you. Thanks, Piper, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first live stream, so hurrah.
Perfect. Well, we hope that it treats you well. So, you mentioned what is the big difference between an associate versus a lawyer?
Okay, I'm an associate professor. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a lawyer at all. So I'm an
Okay, I
educator.
see.
I'm not in law. So
Mm-hmm.
it's
Okay, perfect. And that
different
is
jobs.
great because we have many questions about education. So, while we are on the topic of moving through your career and how you became an associate professor, what kind of brought you to this place in your life today, Leah?
Well, early on, I became a teacher. I was a elementary school teacher, primarily primary or early, and interested in early childhood education. Um, so grades 1, 2, 3 were where I found myself really interested, and then as I moved along, I started furthering my education and ended up doing a master's, which was focused on how to support teachers in understanding the perspectives of autistic children. And also, my son was diagnosed as autistic. And over time, I came to understand my own experience of being neurodivergent and otherwise disabled. And so I had lived experience, my own lived experience, and also parenting my son. And then I pursued further education. Oh, well, and then I started working in the school district I was in with students with disability. And as a resource teacher or inclusion teacher, it's called different things in different areas, but supporting students and families and teachers in including students with disability. And then I did my doctorate in education through Simon Fraser University, and yeah, which was focused on inclusion and
Mhm.
also the way we conceptualize disability, the way we look at disability, and how that conceptualization shapes the way we operate. It shapes our practice. So, actually, my doctorate is in educational practice. So it's what do we do in our everyday, in our attitudes, in the way we do things? What is our pedagogy or our way of teaching? And how does what we think or how we conceive of disability shape our actions and back and forth, right? So yeah, and so I learned about the social model of disability and this whole area called disability studies. Um, and disability studies really has a couple of tenets. One is that you need to inform your practice with the lived experience of disabled people, and that lived experience should be centered. And the other is looking at other models of disability aside from what's called the medical model, where you just see as disabled people as broken and needing to be fixed. And that may have its place in certain contexts. Like if I break my leg, I'm like, medical model me. I want my leg fixed. But if
Mhm.
I'm neurodivergent, I'm actually not broken. My brain just works differently. And so we need to look at how we structure our expectations or what are our considered norms and how we support people or actually harm people when we implement those expectations, especially because it can be quite rigid. The expectations can be quite rigid.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm hearing a little bit of a link between that lived experience model and this sort of expectation that there is around how we are meant to, um, live our lives for those that are experience disability in their everyday life. So, how do these two factors correlate, or what are some misconceptions about this lived experience and expectation?
I guess for me, it really struck me that I didn't even learn about this area of disability studies, and in particular, disability studies in education, after many years as an educator and until my doctoral program. And I was like, why is there this gap between this whole area of study, which in relative terms is pretty new because it emerged in the 80s and 90s. So in terms of like looking at psychology or philosophy, which has been around for many, like age
So
of the,
long,
yeah.
yeah.
So in those terms, it's relatively new field. But I was still really struck by that that doesn't that field of studies doesn't inform our practice as educators, and there was this gap, and that's what really interested me, like why and how can I do work in my research to connect those two things and to bring those ideas of disability studies and educator in education to teachers and parents and disabled people, and so really make those ideas that I didn't encounter till way on really accessible
Mhm.
and really easy to understand. Um, and I'm a storyteller, so it's like, can I do this through stories? And I was a blogger for a long time. My blog is pretty quiet these days, but I love to tell stories and tell a little story about something to help people have the idea. And then I guess there was a really big idea for me was that we have a pedagogy of inclusion,
Mhm.
but we don't practice inclusion in the formation of that pedagogy.
Mhm.
Like we're not including disabled people to inform our practice. And I think that's a really key thing that needs to happen.
Mhm. And you propose such a pivotal point that more knowledge on disabilities needs to be in the forefront of our society so that more people can learn and educate themselves. So, I have brought up your book cover, and I'd love for you to kind of explain why this is one of those resources that can help this issue.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is not my book. It came out in June of last year of 2023. It's called The Person Who Arrives, and it's right there on the title. It's about connecting disability studies and educational practice, or right for teachers and parents and just about everyone. And what it does is it makes these ideas really acceptable, and it has small stories that enact or bring alive the ideas and make them really understandable, so that it isn't lofty. I mean, there is research in there, but it's backed up, and this book evolved from my doctoral research, but but is it was really important to me that the language is accessible, that it's not giant walls of text. It's short stories with lots of breaks and language that's accessible and drawings and doodles and poems, and it has all the things, and it draws the eye, whereas in terms of accessibility, large blocks of text sometimes can be quite overwhelming. So um, yeah, and so just really how I this is an act of advocacy, and the other thing is it also enacts what I'm saying. Not only are the stories in this book my stories, I was graciously granted permission from community members to include their stories. And so it enacts that how do we pull from lived experience? And so it shines a light on other voices and or other people's perspectives. And that was important to me too, because I recognize I have a lot of privilege. And even in being able to go into a doctoral program has a lot of privilege, and also being white, cis, straight, housing secure, food secure, employment secure-ish, all of those things. I was positioned to be able to shine a light on these other perspectives, and bring them along. So to be able to use the privilege I have, um, and and shine a light elsewhere, I think is really important.
I
Yeah.
think it is so evidently clear that accessibility, advocacy, lived experience, and the promotion of marginalized voices is so apparent, even in your just quick run through of what is going into this um, novel. And I think that that is so unique and inspiring because I don't think many people take that approach towards their careers. So, is there any other details as to why you think it is so essential to include different aspects and factors of accessibility into a material like this?
Yeah. As a parent of an autistic son and as a blogger, I learned very early on, and as a quote professional, like an educator, that my voice as a parent and quote professional got more attention and had more leverage or clout than people who were identifying as autistic with lived experience. And I recognized that I had a role to play in saying, "Hey, but also look here."
Mm-hmm.
Right? One of the things I'm most proud of on my blog, which is called 30 Days of Autism, which is named in irony, okay, um, is I have a blog role that points to autistic and other disabled people, and really shines a light on lived experience. And that the blog role, I think, is one of the greatest things on my blog.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, and there's this thing. Have you heard of the Overton window?
I think so, but I would love for you to elaborate.
Well, the Overton window is like this theoretical space of what people find conceptually conceivable.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at, like, for instance, Trump, things that would be outrageous and no one would have accepted, he shifted the Overton window way to the right and way to, I don't know how political we can get here, but way to the right. And so, and what that happens is that what is kind of acceptable has shifted with him, right? So he would be someone who's pushing the Overton window with his out there thoughts. And then there are people who are autistic, and a number of years ago, it doesn't seem to be the case quite as now, but they were framed as, quote, those angry autistics. And they were framed so sometimes by parents.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but they were doing a really important job, right? People like Kassiana Asasamasu and Liwali Midsky and other people, and Boycott Autism Speaks, which I was also a moderator and member of. And we were shifting the Overton window, but they really were.
Yeah.
They really were doing the work and being labeled the angry, whatever. So then when someone like me came alongside and go, with the privilege of the parent role, the teacher role, and said, that actually sounds really not unreasonable. Then what that does is it shifts it. It shifts that window. It shifts
Mm-hmm.
that perspective. So I learned that my owning that role and owning that privilege had this ability to shift things. And so it was very early on, and I also recognized that I need to be quiet and listen and learn and be open to, well, it's the same with racism or
Mm-hmm.
and ableism. I mean, there's many intersections for people, but there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to unpack. There are a lot of layers when, like, we're given these messages in our society that are so embedded and we might not even see them. So when it comes to ableism and attitudes that are just layered in, even the language we use, like saying that the photocopier isn't working, so saying that it's lame,
Yeah.
right? Or calling something like crazy, or there's just so many other words I can use rather than using the language of disability as negative descriptors or as pejoratives. Um, and so I think listening was and learning and being open to examining what are the biases I bring with me, um, and just recognizing those slowly over time, like digging down. I call it in my book undermining, like not undermining as in to topple, but undermining, like digging in and thinking like, what's under this? Like, what is there? And not being afraid to go, yeah, that's not really where I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
I find I have a very similar experience looking at racism and and the way um, society like has the way I was raised in the country I was raised in has layered in things that I need to be really open to examining. Yeah.
So, was this aspect of listening and learning from, the experiences of others, was that something that you developed after your education at Queen's, or was that something that you started to pick
I
apart?
wasn't at Queen. I was at
Which
SFU.
SFU, yes. So was that something you began to pick apart in your education, or was that something that you were really learning about afterwards?
Well, I would say both.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the doctoral program, it takes a long time, right? So it's a process. I mean, at first I was really focused on my experience of teaching and parenting. And then in that process, I was like, well, what about me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where do I stand in terms of my experience of disability? So again, centering my lived experience
Mm-hmm.
was really important in the work I was doing. Um, and I think being brave because well again it's a question of privilege. I had a lot of privilege, so was it brave of me to out myself as disabled,
Mm-hmm.
or actually is it a supportive move? Am I being supportive because it was safe for me to do so?
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to go into my university classes, and sometimes when it was like too loud or too noisy, and they're having all these breakout groups, and I'd be going, maybe we could, have a second room because I can't process all this sound at once, or um, those kinds of things. So I was able to advocate for myself, and I think bringing the language of disability into my own classes
Mm-hmm.
um, is was useful,
Mm-hmm.
and also the recognition that just because I have a need doesn't mean, and I'm going to say this with caution, but I hear the word ableism used a lot, which excites me now because when I began, I never heard the word.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not ableism if necessarily if your kid doesn't get every single thing they need in the classroom, because the classrooms is a community,
Yeah.
and there can be conflicting access needs.
Mm-hmm.
So what works for your child might be problematic for another. And so I really think there's an opportunity there um, to, as a community or in a classroom, for instance, negotiate, have perspective taking of each other's and problem solve. And those aspects, the ability to perspective, like take someone else's perspective and to problem solve and negotiate, those actually build community
Mm-hmm.
um, and understanding. So I think I don't know, I got on a tangent there, but
But I am right there with you on that aspect of community. That is something that I feel like is definitely building to create greater advocacy and awareness around what it is to live with a disability in today's life. So I think that has a very prominent factor today, especially as we start talking about the intertwined concepts of disability and aging. So, of
Right.
course, things do not look the same now as they did 20 years ago, which I'm sure you're aware of. And as someone that learned more about their own disability later in life, I think this is a very crucial topic to discuss. So, as disabilities, and disability awareness evolves and becomes more noticeable and talked about over time, what are some changes you think as a society that you think are falling into place or need to be, iterated further to embrace these changes and acknowledgement of living with disabilities?
Well, I think when you have when you're neurodivergent or have a body that experiences disability, I have both. Um, that the reality for most people is as you age, your body isn't going to do what it used to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we see that through such a lens of loss. And but you think about it, our bodies have been changing and changing. Like when you're one and you're learning to walk and you fall, you just kind of bounce and get back up, or maybe you cry, but it's not right. And me, if I fell, I would probably have a bad injury now, right? And that probably started to shift in my teens and 20s, you know. Um, and but you don't look at what your body does from 1 to 20 and feel like you've experienced loss.
Mm-hmm.
You just go, okay. And so the reality is this is my body and this is my best body, right? I mean, I can do things to support it um, in being as healthy as possible. But I don't, I think there's a parallel to seeing disability as loss
Mm-hmm.
and aging as loss.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see it very explored.
Mm-hmm.
But and the reality is too that if you live long enough, if you're fortunate to live long enough, almost everyone is going to experience disability.
Mm-hmm.
Your body won't work the same, or your hearing won't work the same, or your vision won't work the same. Do you know, like, so looking at that as this is my best body doing its best job for me. Um, and then also understanding the relationship with advocacy and access, and that people shouldn't be erased because they can't get out of their house
Mm-hmm.
or they don't have access to the supports they need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and and also that the attitude that a disabled life maybe isn't worth living,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't think that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think bodies and minds that aren't well supported might might be conflated. If you don't have the support you need, it might create a situation for you where it feels like your life's not worth living. But that's very different than um, saying that it's not. Those are two very different things that get conflated.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Completely. And you propose some very prominent misconceptions that there are, or really standards that there are around the value of individuals and especially women as they age. And that is something I'm coming across a lot in my education as well as in my very fulfilling work that I do here at LC, is that there is a stigma around women losing value in a different way that men do as they age. So when you look at, think of movie stars or whatever, and
Mhm.
like George Clooney, as he started getting deeper crow's feet and his hair, went from salt and pepper to more Arctic highlights. He has that silver fox aspect to him, where if you take the flip side, the majority will see, or society will see women as not in their prime anymore. And that
Right.
is something so crazy to me, because we look at one group of people one way and a completely different way about another. So what are some other common misconceptions that we need to destabilize today about disability and aging?
Well, I have some ideas, but that's just not, I mean, disability and aging is something not widely talked about, but I haven't really, that's not really my area of research.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that the ideas around being disabled as being broken,
Mm-hmm.
um, challenging those and challenging
Mm-hmm.
that being disabled is less than, or uh, are things that we could connect to the
Mm-hmm.
experience of aging. So I think anything like around the ideas of disability studies or disability studies in education, in saying that disability is a natural, normal part of the full range of human experience.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make you an inspiration, like congratulations for getting up and getting dressed today, right? Like, um, and that was in sarcasm font, by the way. Okay. And but those ideas that it's normal, it's a normal, if you look at the full range of human experience, disability is normal, right? It's one of the things. So how do we look at including disabled people,
Mm-hmm.
um, regardless of their age, right? And yes, I believe that has relevancy. Is that a word? It's relevant to people as they age, like in particular, because your body's going to continue to change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can conceive of that as loss.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to tell people how they should or should not conceive of it. But if you look at a disability studies perspective, you could go, yeah, my body's changing. What are the accommodations that I need? What are the hacks I can use? How can I support myself in this process? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of the services and supports that will work for me? And how can I advocate for those? Not through a lens of shame or a lens of, oh my goodness, I'm asking like for this big favor. Like I'm asking for something over and above. And that's a thing that sometimes it's framed as though we're doing a favor to include people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes I've heard um, an educator suggest, and not often, but that, oh, well, if I'm doing that, I'm giving this person an advantage over the other students. It wouldn't be fair. But it's not pie. It's not, a limited resource. If one person's getting what they need, it doesn't mean there's less access for someone else, right? Yeah. So those are things I think are that are important in the way we think about things.
And I'd love to dive deeper about that inevitability that, we are going to change as we continue to age. And aging is a blessing. I will always say that. So, how do we encourage people to feel more comfortable discussing physical or cognitive changes that come with aging without the sense of shame or stigma?
Well, I think it's conversations like this. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you bring up a really good point about the double standard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and how we push back against that.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for this conversation, and
Thank you for
exploring
this
this.
conversation. It is really amazing to sit down with someone who has so much more experience and knowledge in a complete field that I don't know as much about. So, as we talk more about the importance of viewing disability as a descriptor and not something that is a defining feature, how can we shift the perspective as people grow older and their bodies change? What are some of those things we can do for that pushback?
You know what? I think I could maybe read you a little something from my book, if that'd be okay.
Perfect.
Okay. It's a story about my son, and let me find it here. It's called Turn Their Head a Little Bit. After Harrison completed grade 12 in June of 2018, He was accepted into a one-year workplace employment program at the University of the Fraser Valley for students with disability. In July 2018, prior to the start of the fall term, it seemed timely to discuss how some of the other students might not have the same background in understanding disability as identity and disability pride as he does. Harrison had been enrolled in a distance education school for the past 9 years and had seldom encountered people who were not immersed in disability culture and pride, having been quite deliberately surrounded by activist mentors and friends in disability communities. I wanted him to consider that the other students may have only ever been told that individuals such as himself were special and had never even heard of ableism.
Mm-hmm.
I suggested, so people might have been hearing their whole lives from their parents and from their schooling that disability is a word you shouldn't use and that they have special needs and that they're special. Harrison added, yeah, well, they're probably not hearing those from people with disabilities. So there was a comfortable but lengthy pause. And then he went on to explain his notion of gently offering another perspective. So I was thinking about the task program. Try to turn their head a little bit. Like, it's kind of like Xbox or PlayStation. One has more benefits or slightly better benefits. Some people like one more than the other. Like that sort of thing, but with disability. I checked my understanding. So to just kind of clunk them on the head with ideas about ableism and other things might be harsh, but your notion of turning their heads a little bit, showing them there's another way. Yes, he confirmed, like considering Xbox or PlayStation. Oh, I tried to keep pace. It's a metaphor. And in doing that, you're not suggesting what you've been doing is bad, even though you and I might think there's negative things about that. Yeah, just think about a different view, he cut me off, or perhaps graciously supported my ongoing struggle to process all things gaming and just turn their head a little bit. That's beautiful, I added, completely blown away. Harrison confirmed, yeah. And we were both quiet for a long time after that. There was nothing left to say. I have to hang up my phone.
Hey, that's all part of the live showbiz, things we run into.
I know. There was nothing left to say. There you go. And the phone rings right at the dramatic moment of that. So that kind of, it's a little picture of some of the things in the book, but just this story of there's a different way to think about it. Mm-hmm. And I love Harrison's notion of just turn their head a little bit, like just say, there is another way to think about it. And so that's what we're doing here today too, is maybe we're turning people's head a little bit to go, oh wait, there's another way to think about disability or to conceive of disability. Like, and what is disability pride? And do I want to feel pride in everything about disability? No, like chronic pain, I don't have a lot of pride in that, but I can still have pride in myself and my value. As right, there's things I would happily eliminate, but my neurology, the way it works, it's who I am, right? Mm-hmm. You can't take that out of me.
How old was your son when he came up with this metaphor?
Oh, I guess 18.
That is still such a big thought for, someone on obviously the younger side of, society to be thinking of. And to take such a, profound sort of outlook and to manipulate it in a way that more people would understand, that is a sign of true insight. What were some other moments with your son that really made you just step back and say, like, this kid knows exactly what he is doing?
We were at a conference together. Sometimes he would present with me. A big conference in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And we were talking about autism and that. And at the same time, there were Black Lives Matter. It was in 2014. Black Lives Matter was just starting up. And a friend who was also at the conference was following on Twitter, well, back when it was Twitter, and seeing where this protest was, and saying like, do you want to go? And so we tried to track down the protests. So it was at night. We were on the subways. We were going here and there in Washington. It was kind of an adventure. And Harrison was like, not sure he wanted to go. And we both agreed with him that you just say if you want to leave, and we're out, right? We might not even find the protesters. Anyways, we eventually did. And they invited us to join them, which was something like, yes. And then there was a die-in the middle of this four-way intersection, and I was reluctant to join in because I don't want to co-op anybody's, right? But they're like, no, you're here, right? Get down. So, and Harrison ended up like right in there and chanting, and he was right into it. The next day I said, so, here we were at this intersection, and we're surrounded by police cars and, police with guns and all of this. Like, I have a question for you. Were we brave?
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, no, we weren't brave because we're white. Mm-hmm. He said the Black people there were brave. We were supportive. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you got it.
Boom. So yeah.
I'm like, there you go. Social Studies 11, done. So he's had this capacity to take big ideas and put them into just a few words, never an essay writer, but how do you take these huge things and put them into this, we were supportive. We weren't brave because we're white. We were supportive, or just turn their head a little bit. So yeah, I have experience with him doing stuff like that. Yeah.
Just absolutely wowing you. And I
think all kids do that, actually. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a novel thing. I don't think that makes my kid special. I mean, he's not my kid, he's an adult, but he's still my kid, right? Like, okay. So, but I don't think that's a special thing. I think when we listen to people, they have the capacity to tell us their truth, mm-hmm. and what they notice, and to be encouraged to have people value what you're noticing, mm-hmm. or what you're observing, mm-hmm. Is, I think, something that as educators we can give to children and the other people around us. Do I recognize that, mm-hmm. that you have the capacity, and then I'm going to presume competence in your ability to understand and make connections. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is such a important topic to get into, because there is definitely a, sort of stigma around younger people in the workplace and paying your dues and all this stuff. And, they're not as listened to or as respected as people who do have established careers in the same field. So I would love to hear about some insights that you have heard that have, in your listening, been so impactful to you, whether they made an impact in your work, in your book, in your blog, in your outlook on life, that have just stuck around. What are some of those things that have just been so poignant to you?
I had a parent when I was still a primary teacher, like grade 2, and they were so clear with, I remember a conversation with them, and they said, my role as a parent is not to remove obstacles from my child's life. My role is to give them the skills to navigate those obstacles. Mm-hmm. And that really stuck with me. I had this amazing student who was autistic, and we were doing their IEP, and they were participating. and they hadn't really until then, and they were like, this whole thing is about me, and it's like, yeah, and we need you here as part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, well, yeah, of course you do. Like, nobody knows me better than me,
Mm-hmm.
which was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next time we were updating it, they're saying, we're changing all of this, right? And I was like, yeah, we're going to look at all of it. And they were like, because I don't want to be represented now by something that was in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, yeah, like, so those kinds of things, I think really, again, like listening and believing in people and believing what they share with us, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
so much inclination to see uh, particularly disabled people or disabled children as being manipulative,
Mm-hmm.
as trying to get something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even this conceptualization that behavior is communication, and so they're either trying to get something or avoid something, which is sort of like a preset for, oh, you're so manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I don't think very helpful. I think there's a lot we can do to better honor children,
Mm-hmm.
and to better honor disabled children, and to better honor disabled people as important and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't need to be contingent on the sort of capitalist model of what you contribute or what you have
Mm-hmm.
to offer, that you have value just because you're here, because you're you, that
Mm-hmm.
humans have an inherent value.
And what a harsh sort of stigma that is, that um value is based on what, basically what money people can make off of you, what you can do for other people. And just that idea of where that stigma might come from is obviously from people that are in a higher position than the average person, because everyone else that's down on the ground, members of civil society, we all know, like, we need to pay our bills, we need to, have a roof over our heads, meaning we need to work. So if the workplace isn't as accepting of people that are in need of accessibility, how are they meant to be able to function the way that you want them to function in society?
Or we have people who are disabled and are unable to work,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And in Canada, the payment you get,
Mm-hmm.
persons with disability payment,
Mm-hmm.
is not enough to live above the
Mm-hmm.
poverty level,
Yeah.
right? And at least in British Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't you couldn't even pay the rent with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how do you live a life? How do you, right?
So I think we need to talk about what we can do to, bring up more discussion. What important factors should we discuss more that will open people's eyes to that reality, that not everyone can fit this astringent, strict structure that honestly we're needed to to survive in today's society. So, what are some factors that you think will open people's eyes?
Well, I think looking at the supports we have in society, um, and this goes into people that are aging. I know that's an interest of yours too, right? Um, like, what are the supports people need for their life, to live a good life, to be healthy? So access to, health and other supports, like healthcare and other supports are critical. I know in Canada they just expanded a dental program for people with disabilities, and I think older people, and the connection between dental health and overall health is huge. So I'm pleased to see that. I know that the an election coming up, some other government would say, "Oh, we should end that," which is not good, right? So those kinds of things, and then honestly, the ideas in my book.
Mm-hmm.
And even the title, The Person Who Arrives, it's like, who is that person who arrives,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we welcome them?
Mm-hmm.
And it actually comes from philosopher Hannah Arendt, this idea of natality, and
Mm-hmm.
that in that arrival, it is called a moment of natality because we're both born anew. What I do affects you, what you do affects me, and that level of acceptance we can have, that welcoming we can have, it affects both people. So
Mm-hmm.
there's an interaction. It's not just one person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and I think that welcoming that person, whether it's yourself, for me, welcoming my own experience,
Mm-hmm.
and coming to recognize it and see it and own it with pride. And and there's stories in here where I am grappling with the shame or the, oh my gosh, this realization, or, you know, as I'm digging down and learning more, and these aha moments where I'm like, oh, right, that's a thing. Or from a parent's perspective, or from a teacher's perspective, or just a community member's perspective. I mean, I'm a community member. I
Mm-hmm.
have been so um, graciously welcomed, and included. And people have been so generous and open and sharing with me. But I also think that's part of that give and take. I know when to be quiet and listen and learn,
Mm-hmm.
right? I know it's not all about me. And that's yeah. And I think we can continue to look for opportunities to go, who's informing this? Or a movie. Is it about inspiration? Are we taking someone's, like, actually there's someone called Stella Young, who's passed away, but she coined the term inspiration porn.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and not porn as in the sexual sense, but porn as in using somebody else um, for your own gratification.
Mm-hmm.
So inspiration porn is like, I look at somebody's disabled experience and I use it for me to feel better about myself.
Yeah.
Like, at least I might have it hard, but at least I'm not that person,
Yeah.
right? And you
Mm-hmm.
see like these posters of like a child running on prosthetic legs, and it'll say, "What's your excuse?"
Mm-hmm.
Right? So being able to look at a movie and decide, like, is this problematic? Is it ableist? Whose story's being told? From whose perspective? And that goes
Mm-hmm.
right from children's literature to movies we see,
Mm-hmm.
right? Are we taking lived experience, or are we um, doing it in a way that's problematic?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, right? Whose voice is centered? Am I telling the story of my kid, or am I telling my own story? Because that's very different. I didn't want my work to be me telling. I mean, I do relate a story in there, but this is my story. I have to tell my story, not
Mm-hmm.
someone else's story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's important as we go forward, as we consider how we move in things. Yeah, there's a really good website for children's books and literature, and it's called Raising Luminaries.
Mm-hmm.
And they have except books for littles too, is its other name. Um, and they have exceptional lists of books around all sorts of social justice issues. It's
Mm-hmm.
so I just those kinds of things are great. So
And
applying that lens of whose story is it, right? Yeah.
and exactly. You bring up so many amazing points. I'd love to touch first on this idea of stories and who's telling what, at what gain, and who's it impacting. So I think this is such a significant point to bring up because what is the message we're perpetuating? Given who has taken in the story, taken inspiration porn or whatever from someone else's experience and stories and turning it into something else and perpetuating a different idea, that is something that is so common in media today, whether it's movies, on the news, wherever, even in children's stories. And I feel like that is definitely something that is playing into so many of these misconceptions that people have about disability in today's life. I'm thinking the first story that popped into my mind, it's a movie I watched as a part of, I think, religion in high school, because I went to where I grew up, Fort McMurray. There's not very many high schools to choose from. So, like, basically, they're all Catholic high schools, even though I'm not religious. But they're the firstborn of the family. She had a lot of medical needs, like her sorts of organ failures and stuff like that. And it's a very ethical dilemma because they chose to have another daughter who they could basically use.
Oh, this was a book. I remember this. I don't
Yes.
remember the name of it. Yeah.
And they turned it into a movie. Yeah.
And it is very inspirational, and it's not that author's story to tell. They sell a lot of books about a lot of things, right? But there's another movie, and I don't really want to name any of the titles because I don't want to drive any of, but it's really about how heroic it is. This man who's like a wheelchair user. I haven't watched it, so I can only tell you, and it's based on a book too. Falls in love with someone, and then he decides to end his life. So
yep, I know exactly which one you're talking about.
He can give the money to this person, and that really perpetuates this idea that a disabled life is not worth living, right? Or I look at even MAID in Canada, and I know there's circumstances where that is preferable for someone who's gotten, death is imminent and they have some opportunity to make some decisions around that. But it's being offered to people with disability in scary ways. And sometimes it's reflective that they don't have enough services. They don't have the services, so their life is too difficult. And there's a whole bunch of people that were really concerned it's a slippery slope, and it is the slippery slope we were concerned about. And that it can be dangerous for someone to be in the hospital because they can be convinced of and it's more likely that someone will go in with that lens that your life is less than, so maybe I'll offer this to you. Whereas if you went in as someone who was not disabled appearing and who had, wasn't, for instance, a wheelchair user, the likelihood of that being offered to you is way less. So there's these attitudes.
Yeah. And I'm loving where this conversation is going. So to touch on, the movie with the wheelchair, the man in the wheelchair falling in love, and then he ends up, choosing to end his life. I think that story, the way that it's being told and the messaging that it is perpetuating is not something that I've experienced with the people that I know that are in wheelchairs. I grew up a very close family friend, and I ended up being her dance teacher. And yes, she, wasn't able to do the stuff the same way as everyone else, but she had the best time doing her performance. She never missed a class. She was always one of the hardest working, most involved people there. And she never let being in a wheelchair ever stop her from her passion of dancing.
Because she was doing what her body could do, right? It's not like she had an extra body sitting aside, right? So there's this thing about what do you do with what you've got, right? And yes, it's harder if you don't have the accessibility, or we don't have curb cuts, or we don't have elevators that aren't blocked with, or the accessible bathroom isn't used for, my husband's a musician, and sometimes the accessible bathroom is where the musician is told to put their stuff. He's like, that can't happen, right? No, right? So those kinds of things where it's an afterthought or an add-on or somehow an extra. Yeah. Those are things we can continue to push back against.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned about the disabilities that aren't so, obvious. I remember when we originally spoke, what does autism look like? And I told you about a video that I seen on TikTok, and the comment section was, "Well, you don't look like you're autistic," and she's like, "What does
I
that
beg
mean?"
your pardon? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So there are, and again, that can lead back to stereotypes people have
Mhm.
seen. And so
Mhm.
there've been, that like to be autistic is based on like the 8-year-old white boy who lines up trains. And
Yeah.
not that that might not be a thing. That might be a thing for some people, but that's not the only
Mhm.
presentation.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm. Exactly.
So
I would love to turn the floor over to anyone in the audience. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Leah about anything that we've talked about or anything that you think her expertise could be useful in, this would be a great time to do that. And I'm going to ask you a couple questions in the meantime.
okay.
So, as for someone with experience and passion for breaking down biases, what advice do you have to give others out there that are looking to start their own conversations about disability and aging in their own communities?
Well, I would say read the work of disabled people. I'm a big fan of, particularly when we're looking at neurodiversity, of Lee Wiley Midsky. That's LEI. Can you add links at the end? Should we do that?
Yeah, we can do
Oh,
that. We can
we'll
definitely
put
do
a
that.
link for Lee Wiley Midsky. Um, their work. They are the founder of the Neurodiversity Library. Um, I guess, system or whatever. It's not really a system, but this whole movement, the neurodiversity library movement, and they also do these amazing visuals with the neurodivergent narwhals that take really complex ideas and make them very accessible. And narwhals, I mean, they're adorable. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sweet unicorns.
and then so just being aware that there are resources and we don't have to always look to the quote professionals. I'd also
Hmm.
say that terms like neurodiversity are being thrown around a lot, and that sometimes organizations are using it but they don't really mean it, so be
Yeah.
cautious. And then I think that we need to trust what people tell us is going to work for them, and that kind of support, when I believe you, it builds your confidence, it builds your advocacy,
Hmm.
right? It builds your trust to trust yourself. And I think that I think that goes for people as they're aging too. If we trust what they're telling us, and then encourage people to be okay with the way what our bodies need, and understanding that over time that will change, and to encounter that and then break down the shame around aging, around disability. They are in our conversation today have kind of knitted those together, and I was excited to talk to you, Piper, so that was great.
I know it's been so amazing, and I honestly want to go over time just a little bit because we're getting into the real, meat and potatoes of this conversation. So if everyone's okay with that, I'd love to, continue on with this. So we received some questions in the chat.
Okay, I can't see this chat, so can
I,
I?
I'll read them out to you. So
Okay.
I hate to bring up the media again, but what do you think of the show Atypical? Was it a positive representation of ASD?
Yeah, there's a lot you can read if you just Google like autistic people's criticism of atypical, you will find that. I actually didn't watch it because
Hmm.
I had read enough that I didn't.
That it
Um,
put you off, yeah.
that
Hmm.
that and so I can't really speak from personal experience. I just think that it was very stereotyped recognition, and I do. Oh, actually, I did watch one, and the young man who I guess is autistic had interfered in the life and space of one of his teachers, and the excuse was that he was autistic, and I don't think that having a disability is an excuse to not respect other people's boundaries. So found that problematic, and I think that was the one and only one I saw. I probably could speak to that more closely, but I just don't think that I think young teens should learn very clear lessons about boundaries, regardless of their neurology.
Mm-hmm.
That's my
Well, I
bias.
think that is some very good insight, and do with that what you will in the comment section. Another one is, how do you think societal attitudes towards disabilities have evolved over the years, and what still needs improvement?
Well, I think more people are talking about disability, ableism, access. In the US, there's the ADA, which is like on 30 something years now.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still attitudes that it's a special favor, and attitude, even the language around special education, or euphemisms that avoid the word disability. Still very much are indicators of the reluctance of people to say the word disability. And so I think that continues stigma. So I proudly say I'm disabled. Here I am, right? And use the word. And sometimes I get the like raised eyebrow, like, I can't believe you use the word. Like, haven't you heard? It's not something we should say. You should say differently abled, or diffability, or exceptionalities, but the reality is it's a disability. And
Yeah.
so, and I want to say that word because I want to be able to talk about it. I want to bring that language into the room with me, or into the conversation, so that
Mm-hmm.
we're just saying, here's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we support that? And so there's different models of disability. There's a medical model, which I touched on really early in our conversation. There's a social model, and they locate the problem of disability in different places. So the medical model locates the problem of disability. I go into this really in my book, but they locate the problem of disability in the disabled person.
Mm-hmm.
The social model locates the so-called problem, air quotes, of
Mm-hmm.
disability
Mm-hmm.
in society, and in the way we structure systems, and our access to housing, and employment, and education, and transportation, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the identity or pride model, which would say, problem with disability, I don't see a problem with disability. The problem I experience is actually ableism, right? And access issues. So that's important. And then there's also, well, there's many models of disability, but I'm just going to talk about four. And then there is the uh, human rights model, which insists that disabled people must be a part of and included in policymaking. There's so many decisions around what's going to work for disabled people don't involve them,
Disabled people at all, yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I was at a school that was being rebuilt or newly built, and they were customizing this one whole bank of computers to to fit people, and they had a certain height, and then they lowered a table height so that it would be accessible for a wheelchair. Well, wheelchairs are designed to fit at table height.
Mm-hmm.
So they just made like, what do you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like, you didn't ask someone. Or I know someone who works at a school, and they put in an automatic button door, but the way that it opens means they can't actually get in with their wheelchair.
Because if the button's on this side and then the door open this way, then it's like they gotta speed away from the.
Or whatever it
Yeah.
is. I don't know. But those kinds of things, like,
Yeah.
who are we asking?
Yeah.
Right. So those are important
Yeah.
considerations, I think. Yeah.
And I think that it's great that people are starting to consider more of what, you know, these certain aspects are, especially for, people in wheelchairs and whatnot. It's great that they're thinking about it, but shouldn't you get the perspective from the people that are actually, living in it and are affected by it in their everyday lives? So I think that if you want to do something to help, you gotta get the perspectives of the people that are directly impacted.
And that plays really well into inclusion and what we're doing
Mm-hmm.
in schools. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if I am writing an IEP, or
Mm-hmm.
an individual education plan for a student, am I asking that student what's going to work for
Mm-hmm.
them? And are we working on it, problem solving together? Are we figuring it out, navigating together? And do I trust you and believe you when you say this isn't working?
Mm-hmm.
And that builds your confidence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or do I believe you when you say no?
Mm-hmm.
Like so much of the way we operate is based on compliance. You must do this now. And it's done more heavily to children with disabilities than other groups.
Mm-hmm.
With a finer, more narrowed or more focused, like magnifying glass on every little thing you do. I'm going to notice every little thing you do wrong. Whereas a not disabled kid, people aren't looking that closely and they get away with stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those kinds of things, like that surveillance model and that compliance model, is not healthy. And it can train kids to be compliant and to sell their no away to saying yes because they're trained into it. And it's not healthy. It's not healthy psychologically. It's not healthy as young adults or adults to
Mm-hmm.
not be able to state and say your boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, as we wrap up and pull some of these concepts together, what message and key takeaways would you like to leave our listeners with today?
This is an accessible book.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend it. And many others do on the back. It's on Amazon and other places. Check out Lee Wiley-Midsky's Neurodivergent Narwhals and other things, and Books for Littles, or Raising Luminaries. And trust what people tell us, and ask what's going to work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Inclusion is important in schools, and it's important in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that's around disability or aging, we need to be including people.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, whether it is on this active inclusion or not, who is someone from your network that you've come across that you think would have something really important to say on our show in the future?
Well, Lee Wiley-Midsky,
Mm-hmm.
I would say, definitely. And I have another one, but yeah, that would probably be. I mean, I have lots.
Mm-hmm.
I can make you a suggestion, but I'll send you an email. But definitely Lee. You would have a great conversation.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, I have learned so much today. I have had this amazing eye opening conversation, like I said the first time when we met, too. And I hope that our audience has taken something from this as well. We've had a lot of great comments in the chat, but I'd love to thank everyone for coming and going against the grain with us here today to try to, destabilize some, discriminatory standards that we have in our society today, and to have the uncomfortable conversations and get the word out there and really make an effort to change the discourse. So thank you to our audience for coming and joining Leah and I today. And the biggest shout out to you, Leah, for, bringing your expertise to us and me as someone who wasn't as, aware of all these different intricacies. I'm so appreciative of being a part of, trying to make a difference in our conversation today.
Well, thanks. It was lots of fun talking
Mm-hmm.
to you a second time.
Mm-hmm.
The first wasn't out there. It was just you and I. But yeah, thanks for having me. It was a treat. And a shout out to Terry Westerby, who
Oh yeah,
suggested.
Terry was actually the one who put us into contact, and we had an amazing conversation. So guys, feel free to roll back on our page and check out that episode. It was a really great one. And yeah, it's always amazing. Thanks for coming and being here, breaking these boundaries, and we hope to see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye.
What a lovely episode.